All right. Well, my name's James Weiner. Uh, I graduated White Mountain in 2005. I was there for my junior and senior year. Uh, and some of you may have heard about me without knowing the name. If you've heard about a student that had a climbing fall years ago, that was me. There was a climbing competition in the gym there. We had about 150 students going through 9 different climbs. So we had people clipping in instead of tying each individual person in to move through faster. And between me and the wall, the locking carabiner came unlocked and just back clipped through the rope. And I fell about 4 stories, broke 6 bones. So I'm now the reason you need opposite and opposing carabiners to be a sponsored climbing competition in the US. After White Mountain, or while I was there, I did a lot of backcountry skiing. And one of our ski trips took us to the 10th Mountain Division huts in the Colorado Rockies, hiking around in the backcountry for a couple days. And I fell in love with Colorado. So I came out here for school to Colorado University at Boulder. Started in psychology. And then after fighting with my professors almost every day, I switched over to classical history, which was a lot of Greece and Rome, a little bit of Egypt and Norse mythology. And while I was doing that, I got interested in and entered Air Force ROTC. So when I graduated, I got my bachelor's as well as a commission into the Air Force and went in as an officer. In the military, I spent 9 years working space operations, which was a lot of operating and tracking satellites, how ours are doing, what other countries are doing, supporting some overseas operations with spy satellites, communications, that sort of thing. And my last couple years in, that started getting very exciting with a lot of private companies starting to launch communication satellites, what we call microsats. Most satellites launched in the 70s and 80s are about the size of a Greyhound bus. As they got smaller, the most advanced the Air Force started flying were about the size of a VW Bug. And then what Elon Musk and some of those companies are launching are about the size of a shoebox. So much harder to track, much easier to launch 60 or 80 of them on a single rocket. So it made the job exciting and difficult all at the same time. And then my last few years, I got out of operations and went to teach at a schoolhouse down in Colorado Springs at Peterson Air Force Base that concentrates on space operations. People would come from all over the world to our schoolhouse, stay for a couple weeks of training, and then go back. So those classes were specialized in how GPS works, certain communications, how to track different satellite movements. While I was active military, to move up in ranks in the military, you need certain levels of education. I was telling Vesta the other day that after Vietnam, one of the things they realized going back tracking casualty rates was officers with a bachelor's degree lost about 80% fewer people than officers with only a high school degree. And it didn't seem to matter what the education was in. It was more that they had spent time in college, just that being able to research, think through problems, debate them with others, meant they were that much more likely to get the mission done and save more of their people. So since Vietnam, in the US military, every officer needs a bachelor's degree. And as you go up, majors have to have a master's. Most colonels have at least a doctorate. And most of the generals you see on television have 2 or 3 doctorates. We're one of the most educated forces in the world. So I started working on my master's to keep myself open to future promotions. I actually started on a master's in space operations because that's what I was doing, and I couldn't stand it. I spent all of my time fighting through every assignment, trying to get the reading done, trying to write my papers on time, but it was constantly a push to make myself do the work. And a big thing I realized that I want you to take away is, especially in grad work, but when you are picking your senior classes at White Mountain, when you get into college, whatever you go on to do, pick something you're really interested in, because it's much easier to stay focused on one topic for months on end if you like it than if you're just doing it because somebody told you it's where you should be. So I switched from space operations to a degree in emergency and disaster management, which covered large-scale disasters, plane crashes, tsunamis, terror attacks, earthquakes, anything that affects whole countries at once. And at the time, I didn't get a lot of support from my boss. I actually wrote my thesis paper in 2015 about how the US would handle a modern day pandemic. And my commanding officer laughed at me and said, when is this ever going to be applicable? Nobody will ever read this. And then, 5 years later, I'm just pulling it out and telling all of my friends, like, yeah, this is what evacuations would look like. This is how they'd shut down highways. So it's definitely an interesting field to be in because it always comes up, right? History keeps cycling around, and if you learn what's been done, you can be ready for the next one. Last thing about that degree, it's a difficult subject to study because when a disaster is happening, whatever it may be, nobody's standing around taking notes on how many people walked in that morning or how many ambulances did you need at the time. It's always going back after the fact and trying to pull those numbers together. A lot of research through internet articles, libraries, even talking to people that worked in hospitals, police departments, fire stations, but always after the disaster's over. Best case, you can interview those people within a few days of when the disaster ended. Most of the time, it's months or years later, trying to get them to remember exactly what they did or what worked well. And because people remember failures a lot more than successes, a lot of emergency and disaster management is learning what went wrong last time and then trying to come up with a plan to do it better next time. Because having the plan in place is obviously a lot faster than trying to come up with it on the fly. So we'll open that up for questions and then we'll head into an activity.
So like what you were doing in the Air Force with like the space stuff, is that kind of like what Space Force is now?
It is. So when I was going in, you fill out a dream sheet of what you'd like to do. You've spent a while in ROTC or in basic training and you figure out what all the jobs are and then fill out this dream sheet. And mine was all hands-on stuff. I was a very outdoorsy, hands-on person, joining specifically not to spend my time in a cubicle behind a computer. So my choices were intelligence, security forces, aircraft maintenance, munitions maintenance. And just to finish out the paperwork, fill in the last spot, I put down space operations. But they needed people so badly, that's where I ended up. And space was interesting because it's about half engineers and half the people the military doesn't know what to do with. So a lot of political science majors, music majors, arts degrees end up in space operations, which makes it really interesting. And at the time I got in, they were actually thinking of splitting off the Space Force. And then, so at the time, back mid-2000s, the Air Force space and missiles were one branch. So all of the intercontinental ballistic missiles that are still around from the Cold War, as well as satellites, were all one career field, one job. And people would jump back and forth. Every base they changed, they'd go work missiles or come back to satellites, which kept them tied together, but causes problems. If you're changing jobs every 2 or 3 years, how good can you really get at one job? So they were trying to split it off so space people would just do space. And if you spend 10, 15 years there, you'd be great at it. And we'd have the best people in the world instead of trying to retrain them into a new job every 2 or 3 years. But the missile field had a problem. A lot of people got fired. We can talk about that at the end of class if we have a little extra time. And they decided we weren't ready to split it. We needed to figure out what we were doing before trying to do something new. So we stayed together for a while. Last couple presidents talked about splitting up. And then right now they decided it was time to do it and split off the Space Force, which, yeah, right now, if I had stayed in another 6 months or so, I'd be going into the Space Force, as well as they're pulling people that do satellite operations for Army and Navy and putting them under the Air Force Space Force. So it's a big change for them. For me, it just would have been a change of, uniform. For them, they're learning whole new ranks and everything.
And why did you choose the Air Force over like another branch, like the Army or the Marines?
So a lot of it when I started out was the Air Force ROTC program at Boulder. Looked great. The Air Force takes really good care of its people, and some of that's the way it's structured. They all get the same health care, but Air Force bases are generally a little bit nicer. They have a little bit more money. They're a newer branch, so a lot of the military bases get the worst spots in every state. For example, in Alabama, Maxwell Air Force Base, right next to Montgomery, Alabama, is a swamp. And the city gave that Army base to the Army 100 years ago because it was a swamp and nobody else wanted it. And that happens all over the country. Because the Air Force is much newer, all of those spots were already full of Army bases. So they put us sort of next to them, which were slightly nicer, building new buildings instead of stuff left over from the Cold War means nicer facilities. And if you do deploy overseas, just because a lot of it's more technology based, taking care of aircraft and communications equipment and satellites and things means your buildings need solid floors, air conditioning, more electricity access than putting a bunch of Marines in a tent. So the Air Force gets to take a little bit better care of its people. I almost went another way because I wanted something hands-on. When I found out I was getting space operations my senior year of college, the first thing I did was go and talk to the Army and Marine recruiters. And they would have loved to have me, but my command structure in ROTC kind of talked me out of it and kept me in the Air Force. And it was great. It was a good time. I just wish I could have gotten more, hands-on stuff.
What inspired you to write your thesis on pandemics?
So I'd been studying all of these major disasters and wanted to look at something that would affect the US in a large way, modern day. But because we've dealt with a number of disasters throughout our history, and there are more places doing the same things now. Globalization means if you can't ship to Boston Harbor, you can send it to Florida or Los Angeles, and you can still get the products into the US. So another great Boston or Chicago fire or a hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast or something wouldn't necessarily affect the entire country the way it would have 100 years ago. If Massachusetts got hit by a really bad storm 100 years ago, it could shut down shipping for months all over the world. Whereas now, it's barely a blip. They just turn and go to another harbor. So I was looking for something really large scale, and because I was military and a lot of my classmates were military, almost everybody was doing terror attacks. So I wanted to be different, look for something nobody else was doing. Got me into what could happen again, would affect the entire country, and wasn't intentional. And that took me to a disease outbreak.
Was any of your thesis right about how a global pandemic would play out?
So a lot of it was right. A lot of countries did much better with this one because they had an idea what could happen if they didn't do anything. Within the US, a lot of states are sort of handling it on their own. And we're still, a lot of the medical community would refer to as the first wave with this. It's been going up and down a bit, but it hasn't gone away and it hasn't gotten hugely worse all at once. It hasn't really shut down the country, but it hasn't gotten all better either. The 1918 flu pandemic, there were two big waves. And the first one was a lot like this, and people wore masks and schools shut down, and everybody waited it out and then after a few months got tired of waiting. And when World War II or World War I was declared over, victory in Europe, there was a giant parade in Philadelphia with returning troops. And thousands of people showed up for this parade, plus a bunch of troops that were coming back to Philadelphia and then going home all over the country. And that parade was the real big super spreader event that caused the second wave, which was where most of the casualties and illnesses came from during that pandemic. We haven't had that happen yet. And because that was the bigger part of the pandemic, a lot of my study concentrated on how bad things got and how they turned it around from its worst points. But yeah, so far, a lot of it was pretty accurate, how different states would react. It stayed much more open than I thought it would. I thought a lot more states would close down highways and force people to stay home and wait it out. I think one of the big differences is nowadays, so much of our economy is based on everybody going to work because they're all connected. If person A doesn't work, then person B can't do their job, and person C doesn't have anything to ship to get paid to go buy groceries from person D, the farmer. Whereas 100 years ago, most people were living off farms within a 5-mile walk of them. So if the economy shut down and you couldn't get out of town, you could still pick up groceries because that's how you did it anyway. So it's very different today, which is one of the things we'll talk about in our exercise. Planning for the last one doesn't necessarily prepare you for the next one. Vesta, should we move on into that exercise?
Yeah, and as if you have questions, over the next 30 minutes, either write them down or just ask them in the moment. So this isn't the end of question time, but yeah, let's move on to the activity. Do you want to introduce it?
Sure. Yeah, I'll introduce it and then have you break everybody out how you want.
Sure.
So what you're dealing with today is a wildfire has started and gotten pretty large near Littleton, about 30 miles away from campus. And all of the local emergency services, fire and police, have all headed to that area to help. But once they got there, the winds picked up and it started pushing this fire towards White Mountain School. To give you an idea of how quickly that could reach you, over flat ground with the wind behind it, a wildfire can travel about 30 or 35 miles per hour and outrun a horse. So being on one side of Littleton, and starting to cut you off from those emergency services, this fire could be here as soon as an hour from now. So you need to evacuate everyone to a safe area on or off campus and plan on staying for a while. So you're going to need food, water, probably bedding if you can't get back soon. And some questions we want you to think about, and we can post these for you or you can write them down now. Is there anything White Mountain School could do with the available people and equipment you have to mitigate the disaster? So what can you prepare if you only have an hour's warning? Or if the wind dies down, what if you have a day? How much more can you get done? Second question, what goes to the top of your must-save list? So think about people, buildings, animals, student stuff. Can you save everything, or what do you have to prioritize and how do you set that up? And then the third question, what is the worst case scenario here? If the fire department chief calls and talks to you and says, we can send you some equipment, some people, but we need to know exactly what you're worried about to send you the right stuff, and then we can shift our focus to help out in Littleton. What is your worst case scenario? Because anything less than that, you'll be prepared.
So what we're thinking of doing is we're going to split you up into 2 groups and then have each come up with a plan and answer those questions. And then we'll come back together and compare the plans you come up with and what differences, similarities, and discuss it. Okay, so so should we just present both ideas and then discuss pros and cons of different options?
Sure.
Okay.
The first group I was with, you want to go first? You concentrated more on staying to fight the fire.
Is that us?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So basically, what we would do first is we'd like probably have like the people, like the heads, like the administration or whatever, like have a meeting and decide who's going to do what, because there's a couple different jobs which people will need to do. Like we'll need one group to go to the gym and sort out all of the different gear that we'll need to bring. So like tents, camping stoves, sleeping bags, sleeping pads, all that stuff. And then we'll have another group go to the kitchen and gather all the food that they can bring. And we'll also have people who have experience with like chainsaws and like tools go up to West Farm Road and cut down all the trees over there like as quick as they can, and start like building that up into like a fire line. And that way it's like a lot, like the fire won't like come up super close to the buildings, but there's still a chance that like embers will like fly over and land on the roofs and start bigger fires. So we'll have people stand on like the roofs with like hoses and put out like small fires that could start from like embers landing. And we'd also, so we'd bring all the equipment down to the edge field where, and all the students would go down there and wait there. And anybody else want to add anything?
Joanna, Lillian, are there any, or I'm sorry, not Joanna, Lillian, Phoebe, any other things you guys talked about with your plan? So where would you go? Did you say that? Like once you get all the stuff together, then what?
Edgefield.
Edgefield?
And if it comes, like, it starts coming closer, we can use those buses that are there to go farther away.
So what did you decide was the highest priority or the top two priorities? Because I guess human life is probably everyone's priority. So what would be the second one for you?
Building.
Protecting the buildings? Mm-hmm.
And the other group, you concentrated more on packing people up and evacuating. Can you go through yours?
Sure. So in the event that we would need to like do an immediate evacuation, we'd have all the buses and vans and all the faculty cars take all of the students, as many as they could fit into each car. Each student and faculty member would be able to bring a small personal bag filled with their own items. And then half of the cars would drive up to the upper parking lot, and Rose would give them all of the food that we could fit into those cars. And then the other half of the cars would drive down to the gym, and they would get all of the sleeping bags, sleeping pads, sleeping bags, tents, and stoves and stuff, pretty similar to what you guys are saying. And then we would evacuate to somewhere where the fire might not necessarily hit us, so somewhere off campus. And in the event that we needed to stay on campus and wait for rescue, everyone would evacuate to the gym. Again, they would have their like a limited amount of personal belongings, and we would bring all the food down to the gym and set up camp there. And what else? Oh yeah, so our priorities would be people first, and then pets, and then buildings and stuff. And we said that our worst case scenario would be everyone dies and all the buildings burn down to the ground. And so if that were the case and we needed to ask, you know, like all the 911 services for specific things, we would ask for a water truck to fight the fire surrounding just the gym where everyone was. And yeah, that's what we said. Mm-hmm. I might have left something out. Ellen and Joanna J.
I forgot to add something to mine too. We would have somebody make like a short packing list for students to bring with them. That way they don't bring like too much stuff or too little stuff.
Yeah, so both great. Every disaster, you have to roll with it and plan as it evolves and changes. So neither of these plans are all right or all wrong, but you can see they had a lot in common. What are the priorities? Trying to fight or delay the fire, but have a way out, be ready to evacuate. And if anybody's not actively, helping right now, get them out of the way so that you don't have to rush to do it later. One of the really interesting things with emergency plans is, that gives everybody hope for people, is any kind of major disaster, you will always have volunteers step forward and say, I see people hurting or that need help, and I have to help. I can't just walk away. So every major emergency department, from towns up to city size, usually leave about 5 to 10% of the spots in their response charts of who goes where and what jobs they have. They'll leave those open for the people that just walk out of the crowd and raise their hands saying, I'm willing to help, put me somewhere. Because if you don't, those people will just be in the way. But if you plan for them and give them jobs that don't need a lot of training, but still keep them busy and are important, count generators and how much fuel they have, make sure everybody's out of that building by counting how many get on the bus. Your job is to keep all of these dogs in this van, something like that. Even with no training, they can really help by freeing up the firefighters to go do their job. I think all of your plans were really great. One of the big things to think about right now is how different this is with COVID going on. And the answer is, you go after whatever the most immediate threat is. I'm not sure if any of you are doing wilderness first responder or first aid classes or anything. But just like, you look through airway, breathing, circulation for a person that's injured, with a town or city, you look at what is the first thing that will hurt people and then work your way down the list. So get them away from fire today, and then if anybody gets sick because you had 10 people packed into a car, you can figure that out tomorrow or next week. But the fire is a much more immediate threat, so that's where you concentrate your efforts. And I also talked to the first group about, you are all in a great spot. White Mountain is very well set up for a lot of disasters. A lot of you were able to come back to campus because it's so isolated throughout the year. So it's much less of a threat from COVID. So much of the year with students up there has snow on the ground or rainy seasons. So wildfire isn't as much of a threat while the campus is full. And if you do have to evacuate, it's as easy as telling everybody, pull out your backpack and pack for a 3-day overnight trip, because you've all done that before. A lot of you might not have unpacked, and you can be in the hallway in 10 minutes ready to go. So I'll turn it back over to you, Vesta, unless there are any questions.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, it was really when you mentioned the woofer thing, how in these plans, like one of the first steps, along with deciding who's gonna be in charge of which groups, assessing how many people have certain skills, such as emergency medical care. There's a certain number of faculty and a certain number of students who have taken that course. And so being intentional about spreading those people out and making sure they're in different groups in case something happens would be a good thing to think about ahead of time for these types of situations. Does anyone have any questions after this exercise, or just that you've thought about for James, or just in general for either of us? How was it thinking about this kind of scenario on campus? It's not really something we think about that often because we are so isolated and not really in a hot zone for wildfires. Have any of you ever thought about this before?
So it sounds like later in your semester, you might be doing individual research projects. Mm-hmm. And when you get to that, Vesta has my contact information. If you're looking for specific articles or times it's happened in history and having trouble, or just want another example, or you want to know what would somebody do if this happened, or what would be a good way to think about it, feel free to get in touch. I'm here as a resource.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James, for visiting and doing all of this and doing the work to plan it. I think it was a cool class. I hope you all agree that this was a nice mix to the usual routine we have. Cool. So if there are no final questions, then we'll call it a day. Thank you all for being here and for putting the effort in and using your brains.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Vesta.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.